October 15th, 2009. Fort Collins, Colorado, and a frantic father calls 911 screaming that his 6-year-old son has floated away in a homemade weather balloon. Within minutes, news helicopters are in the air, following what looks like a giant silver UFO drifting across the Colorado sky with a terrified child trapped inside. Millions of people around the world stop everything they're doing to watch live television coverage of what appears to be an unthinkable tragedy unfolding in real time. But what if I told you that the child was never in that balloon? What if this entire heart-stopping drama was nothing more than an elaborate hoax designed to make a desperate family famous? Stay until the end, because this story will show you just how far some people will go for their 15 minutes of fame, and how easily the entire world can be fooled by one convincing lie. The story begins with Richard Heene, a man whose obsession with fame and conspiracy theories had been consuming his life for years. Heene was a storm chaser and amateur scientist who had appeared on the reality show Wife Swap twice, bringing his family into the spotlight and giving him a taste of the fame he desperately craved. He lived in Fort Collins with his Japanese wife Mayumi and their 3 young sons, Bradford Rio and 6-year-old Falcon, who would become the unwitting star of one of the most infamous hoaxes in television history. Heene was not just any ordinary father, but a man consumed by wild theories about everything from government cover-ups to alien visitations. He had been working on various inventions and experiments in his backyard, including weather balloons and other scientific equipment that he hoped would lead to fame and fortune. Neighbors described him as eccentric and increasingly erratic, as his dreams of stardom seemed to slip further away with each passing year. The Heene family had been trying to get their own reality show for months after their appearances on Wife Swap generated some media attention. Richard had pitched various concepts to television producers, including shows about storm chasing and his scientific experiments, but nothing had gained traction. He was becoming increasingly desperate as his 15 minutes of fame from Wife Swap faded into memory and his financial situation grew more precarious. On the morning of October 15th, Richard and his wife Mayumi were in their backyard with their 3 sons working on what they called an experimental weather balloon. This silvery mylar balloon was about 20 feet long and shaped like a flying saucer, which Richard claimed could be used for atmospheric research. The family had been working on this project for several days, and neighbors had seen the unusual contraption being prepared in the Heene backyard. According to the story that would soon captivate the world, 6-year-old Falcon had climbed into the basket attached to the balloon without his parents noticing and somehow triggered its release, causing it to float away with the terrified child trapped inside. Richard claimed he and his older sons tried desperately to grab the balloon before it escaped, but were unable to stop it from rising into the Colorado sky. The first 911 call came in at 11:37 a.m., with Richard Heene speaking in what sounded like genuine panic, telling the emergency dispatcher that his son was trapped in a runaway balloon that was now floating at about 7,000 feet, and climbing. The dispatcher immediately understood the gravity of the situation and began coordinating what would become one of the largest emergency responses in Colorado history. Within minutes, multiple law enforcement agencies were involved, including the Larimer County Sheriff's Office, the Colorado National Guard, and the Federal Aviation Administration. News helicopters were dispatched to follow the balloon, while rescue teams on the ground tracked its movement across the state. The story quickly spread to national news networks as producers realized they had stumbled onto compelling live television drama. The balloon itself was both fascinating and terrifying to watch as it drifted across the Colorado landscape looking like something from a science fiction movie. It maintained an altitude of between 6,000 and 8,000 feet, while traveling at speeds of up to 25 miles per hour, carried by wind currents that made its path unpredictable. Viewers could see the small basket dangling beneath the silver balloon, and many assumed a frightened child was huddled inside. Television networks interrupted regular programming to provide continuous coverage of what was being called a desperate race against time to save a child's life. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and all the major broadcast networks carried live feeds of the balloon as it drifted across Colorado, with expert commentators speculating about rescue possibilities and discussing the technical challenges of bringing down a balloon without harming the child they believed was inside. The drama intensified as the balloon began to lose altitude after about 2 hours in the air, raising hopes that it might come down gently, but also fears about what would happen if it crashed. Rescue teams positioned themselves along the balloon's projected path, while helicopters maintained close surveillance ready to attempt a rescue. If the opportunity arose, emergency responders faced an almost impossible situation, as any attempt to interfere with the balloon could potentially cause it to crash, killing the child they believed was trapped inside. Meteorologists and aviation experts were consulted about wind patterns and potential landing sites, while child psychologists discussed how a 6-year-old might react to such a terrifying experience. The balloon finally came to Earth in a field near Keensburg, Colorado, about 50 miles from where it had launched, after a journey that lasted approximately 2 hours and covered 50 miles as rescue teams rushed to the landing site, and television cameras captured every moment. The entire world held its breath, waiting to see if little Falcon Heene had survived his terrifying ordeal. But when rescuers reached the balloon and carefully examined the basket, they found it empty. There was no sign of Falcon Heene anywhere, and no evidence that a child had ever been inside. The basket was too small and flimsy to have safely carried a 6-year-old for 2 hours, and investigators immediately began to suspect that something was not right about this story. The search then shifted to finding Falcon himself, as authorities worried he might have fallen from the balloon during its journey across Colorado. Helicopters and ground teams scoured the flight path looking for any sign of the missing child, while his parents waited anxiously at home, giving interviews to news crews who had descended on their Fort Collins neighborhood. Richard and Mayumi Heene appeared on live television expressing their terror and anguish over their missing son, while their 2 older sons, Bradford and Rio, stood nearby looking confused and frightened. The family's emotional appeals for help finding Falcon touched hearts around the world as millions of viewers watched the unfolding drama and prayed for the child's safe return. But even as this massive search effort continued, there were already signs that something about the Heene family's story didn't add up. Investigators noticed inconsistencies in the parents' accounts of how Falcon had gotten into the balloon, and when they had first noticed he was missing, neighbors also began sharing information about the family's recent behavior that raised questions about their motives. The search for Falcon continued for several more hours, with hundreds of volunteers joining law enforcement and emergency responders in combing through fields and neighborhoods along the balloon's flight path. But as afternoon turned to evening, and no trace of the child had been found, authorities began to focus more intensively on the possibility that he had never been in the balloon at all. Meanwhile, back at the Heene house, investigators were conducting a thorough search of the property and interviewing family members separately to try to determine exactly what had happened that morning. It was during this process that the first major crack in the family's story began to emerge, when one of Falcon's older brothers let slip information that contradicted his parents' account. The breakthrough in the Balloon Boy case came not from sophisticated investigation techniques or forensic evidence, but from the innocent words of a 6-year-old child who had been coached to lie but wasn't quite clever enough to pull it off. As investigators searched the Heene house and interviewed family members separately, young Falcon was found hiding in a cardboard box in the garage attic, where he had been instructed to stay by his father, who had told him this was all part of a big show for television. When investigators discovered Falcon alive and unharmed in the family's garage, the relief was immediate, but quickly gave way to suspicion as it became clear that the child had been there the entire time the balloon was floating across Colorado. Falcon appeared confused and scared, but not traumatized in the way you would expect from a child who had just experienced a terrifying ordeal. Instead, he seemed more worried about getting in trouble for hiding than about any supposed balloon ride. The initial explanation from Richard Heene was that Falcon had become frightened by all the commotion and had hidden in the attic, not understanding that everyone thought he was in the balloon. This story might have been believable, except for several problems that investigators quickly identified, including the fact that Falcon would have heard the massive search effort taking place right outside his house and would have come out when he heard his parents calling for him. Even more damaging was the fact that when investigators examined the balloon more closely, they determined it was physically impossible for it to have carried the weight of a 6-year-old child. The balloon's lift capacity was only about 37 pounds, while Falcon weighed 37 pounds, meaning that even if he had somehow gotten inside the basket, the balloon would never have been able to leave the ground. This technical evidence proved conclusively that the entire story was fabricated. But the most devastating blow to the Heene family's credibility came during a live television interview that evening on Larry King Live, when young Falcon was asked about his ordeal and innocently replied, "You guys said that we did this for the show," before his father frantically tried to change the subject. This spontaneous comment from a 6-year-old who didn't understand the implications of what he was saying provided clear evidence that the entire incident had been staged. The Larry King interview became a disaster for the Heene family, as Richard desperately tried to explain away his son's damaging comment, while Falcon became sick on live television, apparently from the stress of trying to maintain a lie he didn't fully understand. Viewers watching the interview could see that something was seriously wrong with the family's story, as Richard became increasingly agitated and defensive when pressed for details. Within hours of Falcon's discovery and the disastrous television interview, law enforcement agencies shifted from rescue mode to criminal investigation as it became clear they had been victims of an elaborate hoax. The Larimer County Sheriff's Office announced they would be investigating the incident as a possible case of filing false reports and attempting to influence a public servant charges that could result in significant jail time. The investigation that followed revealed the extent of the Heene family's deception and the calculated nature of their scheme to achieve fame and fortune through a fabricated emergency. Investigators discovered that Richard had been planning this hoax for weeks and had involved his entire family in the deception, including coaching his young sons on what to say to authorities and media. Phone records showed that Richard had contacted media outlets before calling 911, suggesting that generating publicity was more important to him than getting help for his supposedly endangered son. He had also sent emails to television producers in the days leading up to the hoax, discussing potential reality show concepts that bore striking similarities to what actually unfolded. The financial motive became clear as investigators learned about the Heene family's desperate economic situation and Richard's obsession with achieving fame and fortune through television appearances. He had been unemployed for months and was facing foreclosure on his house while spending his time pursuing increasingly outlandish schemes to get attention from media and entertainment industry executives. Investigators also discovered that Richard had been researching how emergency responses work and had specifically chosen a day when weather conditions would allow the balloon to travel a significant distance, ensuring maximum drama and media coverage. He had even practiced releasing the balloon on previous occasions to make sure his plan would work properly. The psychological profile that emerged of Richard Heene painted a picture of a narcissistic individual whose desperation for fame had clouded his judgment about the consequences of his actions. Experts noted that his willingness to involve his young children in a criminal conspiracy and subject them to intense media scrutiny showed a disturbing lack of concern for their well-being. Mayumi Heene's role in the hoax was also scrutinized as investigators determined that she had been a willing participant in the scheme. Despite her claims of being manipulated by her husband, phone records and witness testimony showed that she had helped coordinate the deception and had coached the children on their roles in the fake emergency. The impact on the three Heene children became a major concern for child welfare authorities who worried about the psychological damage caused by forcing young children to participate in such an elaborate deception. The older boys, Bradford and Rio, had been traumatized by having to lie to police and media, while young Falcon struggled to understand why he had been asked to hide and then lie about it. The cost of the emergency response became another major issue, as taxpayers learned they had funded a massive search and rescue operation based on a complete fabrication. The Colorado National Guard had deployed helicopters and personnel, while multiple law enforcement agencies had diverted resources from legitimate emergencies to chase a balloon that never contained a child. The Federal Aviation Administration also became involved as the hoax had disrupted air traffic patterns and created safety hazards for aircraft that had been diverted to track the balloon. This federal involvement meant that Richard Heene could potentially face federal charges in addition to the state charges already being contemplated by local prosecutors. Media organizations found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having been completely fooled by the hoax and providing wall-to-wall coverage of a fabricated emergency. News executives began implementing new policies about verification of breaking news stories to try to prevent similar embarrassments in the future. The public reaction was swift and harsh, as people who had spent hours worrying about Falcon's safety learned they had been manipulated by a family seeking fame and fortune. Social media erupted with anger and ridicule directed at the Heenes, while late-night television shows began mining the story for comedy material. The investigation also revealed disturbing details about Richard's history of involving his family in dangerous activities and experiments, including previous balloon launches that had put the children at risk. Child welfare authorities began reviewing whether the Heene children should remain in their parents' custody given the pattern of reckless behavior. As evidence mounted against the Heene family, their story began to change and evolve as they realized the serious legal jeopardy they faced. Richard initially continued to insist the incident was a genuine accident, but gradually shifted to admitting it was planned while claiming it was intended as a science experiment rather than a publicity stunt. The unraveling of the Balloon Boy hoax provided a fascinating look at how desperation for fame can drive people to extraordinary lengths, and how modern media's appetite for dramatic stories can be exploited by those willing to deceive. It also raised questions about the responsibilities of news organizations to verify information before broadcasting it to millions of viewers. The criminal charges against the Heene family came swiftly, as prosecutors recognized the need to send a strong message about the consequences of wasting public resources and endangering lives through false emergency reports. Richard Heene was charged with attempting to influence a public servant, a felony that carried a potential sentence of up to 6 years in prison, plus making a false report to authorities, which was a misdemeanor offense. Mayumi Heene faced similar charges, though prosecutors acknowledged her role appeared to be secondary to her husband's planning and execution of the hoax. The charges against both parents included provisions for restitution, meaning they would be required to pay back the costs of the emergency response, which were estimated at over $62,000, not including federal resources that had been deployed. The legal strategy employed by the Heene family's attorneys was to minimize Richard's culpability by portraying him as a misguided dreamer rather than a calculating criminal, while emphasizing Mayumi's status as an immigrant wife who had been manipulated by her domineering husband. This approach had limited success given the overwhelming evidence of premeditation and the couple's willing participation in media interviews that extended the deception. The plea negotiations revealed the full extent of the prosecution's case against the family, including recorded phone calls, emails, and witness testimony that proved the incident had been planned for weeks. Richard had researched emergency response procedures, studied weather patterns, and even conducted test flights of the balloon to ensure his plan would generate maximum drama and media coverage. The most damaging evidence came from the Heene children themselves, who had been interviewed separately by child psychologists and social workers trained to work with young victims. These interviews revealed that Richard had coached all 3 boys on their roles in the deception, including specific instructions about what to say to police and how to act scared and confused. Young Falcon's interviews were particularly heartbreaking, as the 6-year-old struggled to understand why his father had asked him to hide in the attic and then lie about it to so many people. Child welfare experts noted that forcing a young child to participate in such an elaborate deception could cause lasting psychological damage and recommended counseling for all 3 Heene children. The financial investigation revealed the depth of the family's economic desperation and Richard's willingness to risk his children's welfare for a chance at fame and fortune. The family was facing foreclosure on their house, credit card debt had mounted, and Richard's various business ventures had all failed, leaving them with few legitimate options for improving their situation. Prosecutors also discovered that Richard had been in contact with multiple television production companies in the weeks leading up to the hoax, pitching various reality show concepts that bore striking similarities to what actually occurred. These communications proved that generating media attention and landing a television deal were primary motivations for the deception. The plea deal negotiations dragged on for months, as Richard's attorneys tried to minimize his potential sentence, while prosecutors insisted on jail time and full restitution. The case had generated so much public attention that prosecutors felt pressure to ensure the punishment fit the crime and deterred others from similar behavior. Meanwhile, the Heene family found themselves pariahs in their Fort Collins community as neighbors, and local businesses wanted nothing to do with people who had wasted taxpayer money and emergency resources on an elaborate publicity stunt. Death threats and harassment forced the family to keep a low profile while legal proceedings continued. The media circus that had initially worked in the family's favor by generating the attention they craved now became a nightmare, as every detail of their lives was scrutinized and ridiculed. Tabloid reporters camped outside their house, while internet trolls dissected every aspect of their story, looking for additional lies and inconsistencies. Child protective services became involved as authorities questioned whether whether parents who would involve their young children in such an elaborate criminal conspiracy could be trusted with their custody and care. Social workers conducted extensive interviews and home visits, while the children underwent psychological evaluations to assess any damage from their involvement in the hoax. The federal investigation added another layer of complexity as the FAA and FBI examined whether additional charges should be filed for disrupting air traffic and filing false reports with federal agencies. This investigation had the potential to result in much more serious penalties than the state charges already pending. The scientific community also weighed in on the case, as experts debunked Richard's claims about atmospheric research and pointed out the numerous technical flaws in his supposed experiment. Meteorologists and balloon experts testified that the entire premise of the research was scientifically invalid and that Richard lacked the expertise to conduct legitimate atmospheric studies. The timeline of events on October 15th was reconstructed in minute detail, showing exactly when Richard made his first media contacts versus when he called 911, proving that publicity was more important to him than getting help for his supposedly endangered child. This timeline became crucial evidence in proving criminal intent rather than just poor judgment. The psychological evaluation of Richard Heene revealed a complex personality marked by narcissistic traits and an obsession with fame that had gradually consumed his rational decision-making abilities. Experts testified that his willingness to endanger his children and waste public resources showed a dangerous disregard for others that made him a threat to public safety. The impact on emergency responders became a major focus of victim impact statements, as paramedics, police officers, and National Guard personnel described how they had risked their own safety, trying to save a child who was never in danger. Several responders suffered injuries during the search effort, while others described the emotional toll of believing they had failed to save a child's life. The cost analysis revealed that the hoax had consumed resources equivalent to responding to multiple genuine emergencies, meaning that real victims might have suffered delays in getting help, while authorities chased Richard's fabricated crisis. This calculation of opportunity cost became central to prosecutors' arguments about the seriousness of the offense. Media organizations that had provided extensive live coverage found themselves examining their own role in amplifying the hoax and considered new policies for verifying breaking news before broadcasting it to millions of viewers. The incident became a case study in journalism schools about the dangers of competitive pressure overriding careful fact-checking. The plea deal that was eventually reached required Richard to serve 90 days in jail, followed by 4 years of probation and payment of full restitution, while Mayumi received 20 days of weekend jail time and probation. Both parents were required to perform community service and undergo psychological counseling. The sentencing hearing provided an opportunity for the judge to condemn the defendant's behavior, while emphasizing the broader impact of their actions on public trust and emergency response systems. Judge Stephen Shapansky noted that the case had damaged the credibility of genuine emergency reports and could make people less likely to call for help when they witness real emergencies. The restitution amount was calculated to include not just direct costs like helicopter fuel and overtime pay, but also administrative expenses and the value of diverted resources. This comprehensive accounting sent a message that hoax perpetrators would be held financially responsible for the full cost of their deceptions. The aftermath of the Balloon Boy hoax extended far beyond the criminal convictions and jail sentences, as the Heene family discovered that their 15 minutes of fame came with a lifetime of consequences that would follow them wherever they tried to rebuild their lives. Richard Heene served his 90-day jail sentence in the Larimer County Jail, where he was kept in protective custody due to threats from other inmates who viewed child endangerment as particularly heinous. During his incarceration, Richard continued to maintain in letters to supporters that the incident had been a genuine accident rather than a planned hoax, though this claim was contradicted by overwhelming evidence including his own recorded statements to investigators. His inability to accept responsibility for his actions became a pattern that would continue long after his release from jail. Mayumi Heene served her 20 days of weekend jail time while trying to maintain some stability for the couple's 3 young sons who had become unwitting celebrities due to their parents' criminal behavior. The children struggled with the aftermath of the hoax, as classmates and neighbors knew them as the kids whose parents had lied to the world about a fake emergency. The financial restitution proved to be a crushing burden for a family that was already facing foreclosure and mounting debts. The doll was $36,016. They were ordered to pay represented money they simply didn't have and would struggle to earn. Given Richard's unemployability following his criminal conviction, this debt would follow them for years and limit their ability to rebuild their lives. The psychological impact on the 3 Heene children became an ongoing concern, as child welfare experts noted that being forced to participate in such an elaborate deception during their formative years could cause lasting damage to their ability to trust authority figures and understand right from wrong. All 3 boys required counseling to help them process their experience and understand that their parents' behavior was wrong. The family was forced to leave Colorado as they became pariahs in the Fort Collins community, where neighbors and local businesses wanted nothing to do with people who had wasted taxpayer money and emergency resources. The constant harassment and threats made it impossible for them to maintain a normal life in the place they had called home. Their attempts to relocate were complicated by Richard's criminal record, and the family's notoriety as the Balloon Boy hoax had become a permanent part of internet history, ensuring that a simple Google search would always bring up their deception. Potential employers, landlords, and even schools were reluctant to associate with the infamous family. The media attention that Richard had so desperately craved became a curse, as tabloid reporters and internet trolls continued to follow the family's every move, looking for new angles and updates on their post-hoax lives. Every attempt to start over was complicated by their inability to escape the shadow of October 15th, 2009. Richard's attempts to return to storm chasing and weather research were unsuccessful, as the scientific community had completely rejected his credibility following the hoax. His claims about atmospheric research had been thoroughly debunked by real experts who noted that he lacked the education and expertise to conduct legitimate scientific work. The family's financial situation continued to deteriorate as Richard proved unable to find steady employment due to his criminal record and infamy. His various attempts at business ventures failed as customers and partners were reluctant to associate with someone who had demonstrated such poor judgment and dishonesty. The children's education became another challenge, as schools were hesitant to enroll students whose family notoriety might disrupt the learning environment. Homeschooling became the only viable option for periods, but this further isolated the boys from normal childhood experiences and social development. The legal consequences extended beyond the criminal case, as the family faced multiple civil lawsuits from organizations and individuals who claimed damages from the hoax media company sought compensation for the resources they had devoted to covering the false story, while emergency responders filed claims for overtime costs and emotional distress. The Federal Aviation Administration imposed additional penalties related to the disruption of air traffic caused by the balloon flight. These federal sanctions included restrictions on Richard's ability to conduct any future weather-related activities and potential additional fines that added to the family's financial burden. The case became a permanent part of law enforcement training as an example of how modern media and social networking can amplify false emergencies and create massive resource drains. Police academies and emergency management programs began using the Balloon Boy incident as a case study in recognizing and responding to potential hoaxes. The psychological evaluation reports that emerged during sentencing revealed the extent of Richard's mental health issues, including narcissistic personality traits and an obsession with fame that had overridden his parental instincts and common sense. These reports became part of the permanent record and would follow him in any future legal proceedings. The impact on legitimate emergency response became a long-term concern, as the hoax had damaged public trust in breaking news reports and made both media and authorities more skeptical of dramatic rescue stories. This increased skepticism could potentially delay responses to genuine emergencies, as responders became more cautious about committing resources without verification. The children's long-term prospects remained uncertain as they entered adolescence, carrying the burden of their parents' notoriety and the psychological damage from being forced to participate in criminal deception. Their ability to form healthy relationships and succeed in school and eventually careers would be influenced by experiences most children never face. The documentary and true crime industry found ongoing interest in the Balloon Boy case, as it represented a perfect storm of modern media manipulation, family dysfunction, and the American obsession with fame. Numerous books, documentaries, and podcast episodes examined different aspects of the story, keeping it alive in popular culture. The immigration consequences for Mayumi Heene added another layer of complexity, as her criminal conviction potentially affected her residency status and ability to remain in the United States with her children. This threat of family separation created additional stress and uncertainty for the already traumatized household. The case also highlighted broader questions about child welfare and parental rights, as authorities struggled with how to protect children whose parents had involved them in criminal activity while avoiding further trauma from family separation. The balance between punishment and child protection remained an ongoing challenge. Richard's continued attempts to monetize the family's notoriety through book deals, interviews, and appearances were largely unsuccessful, as publishers and producers had learned to be wary of hoax perpetrators seeking to profit from their deceptions. The market for Balloon Boy content proved to be limited and short-lived. The technological aspects of the hoax became obsolete, as social media and instant communication made it much harder to sustain elaborate deceptions like the one the Heenes had attempted. Modern verification systems and real-time fact-checking would likely have exposed their lies within minutes rather than hours. The legacy of the Balloon Boy hoax ultimately became a cautionary tale about the dangers of fame-seeking behavior and the devastating consequences that can result from involving children in adult criminal schemes. It demonstrated how quickly modern media can amplify both genuine emergencies and elaborate deceptions, while showing the lasting damage that can result when parents prioritize their own desires over their children's welfare. The case remains relevant today as social media influencers and reality television continue to blur the lines between authentic experience and manufactured drama. The Heene family's story serves as a reminder that the pursuit of fame and fortune can lead to devastating consequences that affect not just the perpetrators, but innocent children who have no choice in their parents' decisions. Today, the Balloon Boy hoax stands as one of the most comprehensive examples of how a single act of deception can spiral into a lifetime of consequences affecting multiple generations and serving as a permanent reminder of how the modern media landscape can both create and destroy reputations in a matter of hours.